Okay, so this webinar is about the LCG Cannabis Index and the shares that go within that index, but also the individual share CFDs that are available to trade through LCG. Normal format for the webinar is that if you do have any questions, just please put them through the chat window here, and I'll do my best to answer them as I see them. If I miss them during the webinar, I'll try and cover the questions at the end. But it's all fairly straightforward stuff. I'm not going too heavy in-depth balance sheet analysis or anything along those lines of these particular cannabis companies. I wanted to, what you'll see in a minute, give a bit of an overview of what LCG specifically is offering, and then just the industry itself, and then have a look at some of the charts of these companies. Right, so this is what we're looking at. An intro to cannabis shares. Why are we talking about this? What's the big picture here? What do we need to know if we are going to trade this market? Obviously, the next stage of that is, well, what's moving it? That's number two. Specifically, we have a cannabis index. I'm sure most of you, if you are LCG clients, you're familiar with what an index is, or I'll cover that in brief. But an index, just the same as the FTSE 100, is the top 100 shares in the UK. We have an index created with LCG that has cannabis shares in it. I'll explain a bit how that's made up and some of the potential benefits of trading it. Obviously, all this is doable through the LCG Trader at MT4 platform, so I'll show you where all this stuff is, and then, as I said, go through some of the ideas I have about the charts of these individual companies. I think, and just give my take on where we're at, potentially, bigger picture with all these companies and in the industry itself. Okay, well, so what's the big idea with cannabis share CFDs? Well, the big idea, and the reason this has already experienced a fair bit of mania, is we're looking at legalization of marijuana globally, particularly in the developed world. And obviously, in Canada, it's completely legal to have cannabis, much the same way it is in the Netherlands. Although in the Netherlands it's decriminalized, in Canada it's actually legal. So there are some restrictions on that. I'm not familiar with all the details, to be honest. We don't need to be for trading these shares. But the reason I mention Canada is that a lot of these top company shares are based in Canada, and some of these shares, because they've got that first mover advantage, are going to inevitably end up being some of the top companies in this industry. And I'll get more into that in just a moment. But you can see this chart on the right here is really what we're going for, bigger picture. If you believe this chart, now obviously 16, 17, 18, that's all known. The projections into 2019, 20, 21, etc. This is the potential growth rate of this industry, and you can see the charts split into the two shades of green. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but I think we all broadly understand that there's recreational use and medical use of marijuana, and you can see the growth of these industries. And if this growth does come off, then some of these companies have to benefit. And again, we'll go back into why perhaps an index can help you there, because it creates that kind of diversification to capture this overall industry growth, if you think that's what's going to happen, versus individual company shares that can end up being the next Google or Microsoft of this industry. And just quickly, the way these companies split up is three main categories. Now, this obviously could expand in the future. Who knows how software and everything else is going to get involved here. There may be some kind of technological edge that you can gain at some point. But for the moment, the main cannabis companies are growers, the support services like transport and such like, and providing the equipment for growing, providing the chemicals for the growing, etc. And the pharmaceutical companies. So there are some dedicated healthcare companies that are working on cannabis products. Obviously, all of that is geared towards the medical side of the industry, and so they're the three main types of companies you want to deal with. So even if you're not buying the index, which has a broader range of companies, but you are interested in buying a few cannabis company shares, you probably want to be somehow covered in some of those areas, or maybe you think that one of these particular areas expands more than the other. I would argue that growers is the more speculative end, where the most gain and the most risk is to be found. Support is a bit more stable, but it's obviously very much related to how much the industry grows. There won't be as much need for support if the industry doesn't grow as much as expected, or will be. There'll be more need for support services if the industry grows faster than expected. And of course, these pharmaceutical companies, you could even argue that they are, particularly when it comes to biotechs, they are probably maybe even more speculative than the growers, because if you do hit that wonder drug that somehow uses cannabis to cure or ease this pain symptoms a lot of the time for some of these chronic diseases, then obviously that company stands to do very well, and shares should reflect that. And then I think most of you are probably aware, particularly the LCG traders, but CFDs are contracts for difference. So when you're trading CFDs, the key thing to know here is that you're not trading the actual shares. The shares are the underlying asset, and these contracts are just an agreement between you and the broker to trade between the opening and closing price of your trade, and that price will reflect the underlying asset, which in this case is these cannabis company shares. Hope that makes sense. Plenty of material out there on CFDs from LCG if that's a little bit of a source of uncertainty to you, but I hope that clears it up. So what moves the market? So I think there's big picture stuff, and there's the macro, which probably more relates to your general sense as to the growth of the industry and actually the LCG index, cannabis index. But the big thing, as we said before, it's all about the legalization of cannabis. The market, obviously there's a huge black market, but what we're talking about here is the legal market, right? You can't trade any shares, nor would you want to, for the black market. But we're talking about this, particularly in the US, which is the highest growth potential, but also Europe, which countries and states legalize for either recreational or medicinal use cannabis. And if you follow these, even with Google search terms and search results, and you follow the cases of various US states and whether they either successfully or not so successfully pass legislation, that is a boon for the overall industry. There haven't been as many failures of late. I think as the recognition kind of generally rises, obviously you get a few original states, Colorado and the likes, that were a bit more pioneering. But now now that they've set the path for the others, it's not such a tough sell to, particularly in the States, more traditionally Christian, perhaps even lawmakers. It's when you see others doing it, you're more inclined to. So actually, it's been more successful on the state level in the US of late. The other massive thing is that I put here country or state legislation. If and when, and I think it probably is a when, the cannabis gets legalized on a federal level, i.e. the federal government, Congress and the Senate and the White House, when they agree to its legalization, then that's really the big one, because then it pretty much opens up all the states to be able to legalize. At the moment there's a bit of conflict between the state and the federal level in the US. Big point, obviously the overall point is that it's a growing industry. And then the third point, which I'll touch on a bit more just generally when we look at the charts, is that actually, I mean, I'm not talking to you about these shares like I've got some brand new original idea here. There's already been an absolute surge in these cannabis company shares. There's been an absolute boom, and there's actually been a fair bust afterwards. It was pretty bubbly conditions at one point, particularly Tilray, which is one of the company shares that we offer. After the IPO, those shares absolutely rocketed. I think I'm not wrong in saying it's around 300%. So, and then they've subsequently come back. So then that's the point here, is that I think that we could well be in the midst of the second wave. So we've had a boom, we've had a bust, we've basically, in trading terms, we've had the pullback, but now do we have the longer, you know, if you're an Elliott wave person, we have that longer third wave, the first wave, second wave pullback, and then we do have a long stretched out third wave of where this industry can grow some more. If such a wave is going to happen, now is the right timing. You know, at the top of the boom obviously was not the right timing. And then on a micro level, which again I mentioned at the start, I'm not going to dig too deeply into, but these are shares at the end of the day, so you want to follow the company news, how their earnings are doing, the expectation for their earnings, and obviously how those earnings relate to the price of the shares and how the valuations are. And back to my same point about the second wave, valuations now are much more reasonable than they were just even 12 months ago in these cannabis shares. So you typically, for the long term especially, want to be buying shares at a decent valuation for future long-term growth. But even if you're trading short-term more momentum, you don't necessarily want the chart heading down, as some of these charts are at the moment. But you don't want them overvalued, because the trend is just going to could end at any time. Anyway, we'll look at more of that in the charts in just a minute. So let's talk about this the LCG Cannabis Index, and this is really interesting. And for some of you, this may be even as far as you need to go in this webinar, because you don't even necessarily need to know about the individual companies. If you just have a good feeling about what you've read around the industry, what you're listening to here, about where cannabis and legalization is going, and at least you know that as a group, as an industry, cannabis companies should do well, then you can look at this index. So how are the shares selected for the index? Some of you may have read this already. It's a little bit convoluted. I'm going to read it out, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of breakdown of what exactly that means. So the LCG Cannabis Index is designed to measure the market performance of companies with more than 50% revenue exposure to the cannabis industry and traded at global liquid stock exchanges. So the short and sweet of that is that this index is designed for companies that make more than 50% of their sales out of cannabis. So really this index is aimed at pure cannabis companies. So to put that in perspective, there are some big multinationals, PepsiCo is always the one that strikes a chord with me, that have, you know, dipped their little toe into the cannabis industry with you know, hemp infused drinks, for example, or at least have talked about doing so. And so obviously they, to some extent, are a cannabis share, but they have nothing close to 50% of the revenue. So this index is meant to be pure cannabis, not just a more diversified, just blue chip companies that have mentioned cannabis in their prospectus once. And then the other point, and this is just true of all the things that are traded with LCG, is that these shares are big, global, liquid. That means it's easy to buy and sell with low spreads at major stock exchanges. What we're offering here is not the cannabis penny stocks. It's you know, that's the high risk, high potential end of the cannabis market. You know, you buy some, you know, small, very low priced stock of some very startup company, Of course, if it does end up becoming the next Amazon of cannabis, then you stand to make an absolute fortune. But the chances of that actually happening are pretty remote, and these small companies are pretty prone to manipulation. So that's fine. That's all well and good, trading the penny shares. I'm not saying it's bad to do it or anything. I'm just saying that's not what LCG is offering here within the index. These are the top 20 companies. So this index, and I'm going to tell you a little bit now about, in terms of the next question, how is it constructed? The index is calculated and disseminated on a gross total return basis with USD as its base currency. The largest 20 stocks from the resulting universe are selected. The weighting is done on the basis of market capitalization, capping in the largest positions to 15% to reduce issuer concentration. So first thing to note there is that it's in dollars. If your account's in another currency, obviously keep in mind there's a slight FX effect there, and also that it's basically traded based on North American hours. So I think it's just about actually started trading as we started this index. I didn't even necessarily plan that. Oh no, let's see. I think we've got about maybe a half an hour or so to go before it starts trading live. Let's have a look when we go on the platform anyway. But it's basically in line with US, like the S&P 500, that kind of trading hours, the New York Stock Exchange kind of trading hours. So it's the largest 20 stocks. So there's a universe of stocks that meet this criteria of being 50% revenue to the cannabis industry and global liquid exchanges, etc. But this index only selects the 20 largest of that universe. So basically the index is actually automatically adjusted to fit the biggest 20 companies. So if some other company that's currently the 21st largest, for example, suddenly makes some stellar earnings, and the shares move up and it looks like it's doing well, it then becomes part of the index. So it's not like you even have to double check to see these 20 companies, are they still good? The index is actually automatically adjusting. And the weighting is done based on market cap, so the biggest companies will have the biggest weighting in the index, but it's capped at 15%. So no one company represents more than 15% of this index. And here it's talking about issuer concentration, but it's basically to keep the index diversified. Right, let's have a look at the LCG Trader and MT4 platform to capture some of these shares. Let's have a go. Okay, so this is actually the index. Bear in mind this is an H1 chart. It's LCG's index. So, we've only got a month's worth of data here, so I'm on an hourly chart, so don't read too much into this. But as I said, the industry's, the share prices rather, we're in a bit of a pullback stage at the moment. So, talking about the top up here around 750, we're around 630 at the moment at the time of this webinar. Where do you find it? So it is an index. So in the Trade Watch area here, it's under indices, and then as we said, it's a US index. And then at the bottom there you can see Cannabis Index, and it's got all the details that you need to know in terms of the trade statistics, how you can set your stop losses, guaranteed stop loss, the funding charges for holding it overnight, etc., etc. And so obviously what I do here is just I create a new chart, or get a new order in the deal ticket as you would always do. So I think that's simple enough. Let's, while we're at it, so outside of indices, right here at the top of the list of shares, we've got obviously shares for all these different countries, a lot of different shares available through LCG, but at the top of the list here we've got the cannabis shares, all nice and easy to see. I cannot confirm at the moment if this is displayed like this in a demo account. I believe it is, but certainly it is in a live account. And these are, at the moment, we've got 16 of the top cannabis shares. There's a fair amount of overlap between these shares and what's in the index, but not completely. But again, these companies, the idea here is that they are some of the biggest company shares out there. And then you can also see that the similar kind of pullback that we've been witnessing in the index as a whole is noticeable through the individual company shares. So this is even this is not even the full picture here. You can see some. I think these price charts are going to be longer dated at some point, but you can also obviously see these charts in a longer term, simpler, non-tradable form on things like Yahoo Finance. And so these are all the different company shares. Let me jump over to MT4 while I'm just sort of showing you where things are. This is the MT4 platform, and so when you're in MT4, I'm sure most of you have done this anyway, but what you do is you just right click in here and make sure you show all symbols, and it's pretty nicely laid out in terms of major currencies at the top, and we've got a section for metals and indices, etc. UK shares, US shares, and then if you scroll straight to the bottom, right at the bottom there, that's it. Cannabis that is the cannabis index. It's tradable through the LCG MT4 platform, and so here you can see quite cleanly the again the kind of pullback that we're into at the moment. So if I'll leave MT4, I'm going to jump right back to the LCG trading platform. If I put a few indicators on here, but you know, in this kind of chart, let me get back to the index. You can basically see that we're in a pretty hefty downtrend on the short term at the moment, and obviously always worth noting with CFDs. I mean, I'm talking about the longer term potential of the industry, but the great thing about CFDs is it's incredibly easy to go short as well. So maybe you can and I think this is perfectly reasonable, you can simultaneously believe in the longer term growth of the industry, but believe that conditions have got a little bit bubbly in the short term. So you could be buying, company shares for the long haul, but you could be hedging that with a short trade on the index in the short term as this bubble bursts and we get back to more reasonable valuations to set us up for potentially that big new wave higher excuse me, that I was talking about earlier. But anyway, if I do on the platform here, if I add on, for example, simple moving average, if we put like a 20-day moving average on there, you can see that, it's pointing lower. It's in correction phase. So as the depending on what you use as a basis for determining your trend, you could wait for some sort of short term, and bear in mind again, this is an H1 chart. If you're trading a bigger term picture using the kind of daily or weekly candlestick charts here, which cover multiple months and even years, your starting point for that longer term trade can be when this short term picture gets more positive. So a move back above, if the market kind of developed like this, we've had a big leg down here, say we rallied up, then the market tried to come down and make a new low, but failed to do so. And then there was a bit of a kind of stuttering around. Maybe it tried to head lower again, wasn't able to, or maybe it did, and there was a little false breakout. And then we've got something like this, where we had an area that had been important resistance suddenly becomes an area that you look for as support. Then it'd be something like this kind of scenario where you can start to think, oh, okay, maybe this is either going to be a short-term period of strength, in the market that I can buy into, or this is the beginning of a big second move higher in the overall industry. So that may be maybe a way to kind of help your timing if you're less inclined to just kind of buy on the straightforward dip. Obviously, if you're buying up here, you got a bit more confirmation that the index is bottoming out, but you don't have as good a price level. But if you are buying here at this better price level, obviously you stand to you stand more at risk to further declines because there hasn't been that kind of confirmation that you get from the price moving up here. If there are some more questions on the individual companies that we offered, or if there are more shares you would like to see offered, certainly make suggestions to us. I can't guarantee it's going to be on offer, but most of the time we're pretty able to accommodate as long as it kind of meets that criteria I mentioned of being a big global liquid asset. We may well be able to add, and I think the plan is to add more cannabis individual shares in the future, and make sure to have a look at this index. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope that offered some sort of information, and at least, if not good information, at least a decent soundtrack. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.